Welcome to Crossroads, everyone. Your host, Joshua Philipp, and today we're going to be talking about China's academic espionage, doing something a bit different than normal. And so for those of you tuning in, sorry things have been a bit slow on the channel lately. I'm sure some of you are aware I actually started another project focused on China news, but I'm going to be merging that into Crossroads. So you're going to count on seeing some new videos on here. You might notice we have a new playlist, the China Report, which is the name of the other program I was doing for a bit. When it comes to the Chinese Communist Party and some of the news we're seeing coming out, oftentimes we'll see headlines like, for example, this Harvard professor who was recently charged for being part of China's Thousand Talents program, like these hackers who were just indicted by the Trump administration, these 4 Chinese hackers in the Equifax breach. You know, we see headlines like this, but it's hard to make sense of them. And so I wanted to do some reporting, and so the video today, for example, really explaining what's really going on with Chinese espionage, how it really works, what are the organizations involved, what are the program names, and so on. At Epoch Times, I'm a senior investigative reporter. I've been investigating Chinese subversion and overseas operations since 2008. And so, in fact, I was one of the first journalists, as far as I know, who exposed what they call the United Front, which is how the Chinese Communist Party uses front operations in the U.S. And so with that said, we're going to be jumping in now to this presentation I have. And actually, I just gave this presentation last Friday at Pace University, and I thought it'd be nice to do it here as well. This is the Department of Justice document I have here, talking about Dr. Charles Lieber, who was the chair of Harvard University's Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department, not a minor figure. He was charged alongside 2 Chinese nationals, one of whom is allegedly tied to the Chinese military, an officer with the PLA, People's Liberation Army. And he's being charged with allegedly, says, unbeknownst to Harvard University, beginning in 2011, Lieber became a, quote, strategic scientist at Wuhan University of Technology in China and was a contractual participant in China's Thousand Talents plan from in or about 2016 to 2017. It'll be interesting to see what the broader context of all of this is, because allegedly one of the Chinese nationals he was involved with was caught trying to smuggle vials of some biological compound. What that biological compound was, we have no idea. But given the rumors about what's happening in Wuhan right now with this coronavirus, and most of China now with this coronavirus, it's pretty significant, not to mention the fact that he was working with the Wuhan University of Technology and also allegedly was working with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which notably runs that P4 lab in Wuhan, where a lot of rumors are circling around right now. But back to the point, academic espionage. You might have also seen that right after this Harvard professor was charged with these crimes, the U.S. Department of Education put out a notice. It says, quote, since July, the department has uncovered more than $6 billion in unreported foreign gifts from countries including Qatar, China, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. They're currently investigating Harvard and Yale. The Department of Education found Yale received at least $375 million in foreign gifts or contracts that it did not report over the last 4 years. And here's a direct quote from this. Quote, nearly 70% of U.S. schools that receive more than $250,000 from Hanban, which is in China, of course, Chinese Communist Party related, failed to properly report that information to the Department of Education. So in other words, one Harvard professor, head of the chemistry department, charged for taking finances from China that he did not disclose, allegedly involved with technology transfers to China. It seems that a very large number of people could be facing very similar charges if the U.S. government so chooses to pursue that. This is interesting. So as an investigative reporter, I don't just look at surface news stories. What I look for are 2 things. I look for, 1, patterns. If there's a pattern in incidents, because that suggests sometimes that things are happening beneath the surface and we're seeing bits of things popping up on the surface. The other thing I look for are anomalies. things that are out of the norm. And when I see patterns and anomalies emerging together, it usually suggests to me that something big is at work. And that's when my interests get piqued and I start looking into things. Just the past couple weeks, there have been some, I'd say a large number of very serious cases involving China. And I'll go over a few of them now. You might have seen that Mike Pompeo came out publicly talking about the United Front. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party's for overseas operations. And not only did he call it out by name, but he also said something very interesting, which is that the Chinese Communist Party, according to him, has databases on every single governor in the United States. Every single state, they have a profile of the governor. And in that, they have basically a rating on what their positions on China are, whether it be unfavorable, say lukewarm, or favorable. In addition to that, he also called out the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, and this is something we need to go into in the future. They call them CSSAs. Basically, they operate under most universities in the United States. And these are Chinese student groups that are financed and directed by the Chinese consulates. They are oftentimes used in what do you call influence operations of the Chinese consulates. So we're going to be going into deeper details on both of these departments. In addition to that, 4 Chinese officers were charged, I'll show you the FBI document on this, in the Equifax breach. And they're being charged with being part of the alleged 54 Research Institute. And what is the 54 Research Institute? Now, normally when we hear institute in the U.S., we think academia, college institute or something like that. No, this is very different. Now, some of you may remember in 2014 when the Obama administration indicted 5 Chinese hackers. The current one seems very similar to that. Now, those hackers were with the General Staff Department, 3rd Department. The General Staff Department is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military. The 3rd Department under it is the Signals Intelligence Branch. So why was the Signals Intelligence Branch of the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military stealing intellectual property from the United States? Why was the war-fighting branch of a foreign military targeting American businesses? This is a question that's, I think, very important to ask. And under the General Staff Department, 3rd Department, you have about 22 operational bureaus and about 4 to 5 research institutes. Now, when I first saw the news on the Equifax breach and these 4 Chinese hackers now being charged as, basically carrying that out, I thought, oh, well, Research Institute, of course, General Staff Department, 3rd Department. After looking into it a bit, though, I found that's not the case. And this actually makes the Equifax breach even more interesting. Now, Equifax is a credit company. In other words, it has information such as credit card information, social security numbers, personal identifying information on Americans. The credit cards were allegedly, there's no evidence for now at least, that they were used for any kind of theft. In other words, this was very likely not a financially motivated cyber attack. This took place in 2017. 54 Research Institute was not the 3rd Department. It was different from the hackers who were charged in 2014. These guys are with the 4th Department. The 54 Research Institute is with the General Staff Department, 4th Department, or was, and I'll get into that. That is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military, General Staff Department, then the 4th Department, which is the Electronics Intelligence Department. Why was the Electronics Intelligence Department of the Chinese military's war-fighting department stealing personal information on American citizens? This is a serious question to ask. And interestingly, the 54 Research Institute was recently in China transferred under the Strategic Support Force. And in fact, the moving of it, which is another military branch, the moving of the 54 Research Institute to the Strategic Support Force was taken as a sign by a lot of China watchers that the Strategic Support Force had gained electronic warfare capabilities. How is it that electronic warfare operations are stealing personal information on American citizens? What in the world could they possibly be doing with that information? What would the Electronics Intelligence Department of a foreign warfighting department want with personal information on Americans? serious questions to ask. I can give my own analysis on it. Several years ago, I actually broke a story and had multiple sources on it, claiming that, of course, the Chinese Communist Party has internally what they call the social credit system. This is basically a smart city technology, if you want to call it that allows for the Chinese Communist Party to maintain databases on every single Chinese citizen. It tracks online purchases, it looks at who their friends are, it looks at what their beliefs are, it makes profiles of them, and then it assigns them a citizen score based on those profiles. Your citizen score is going to determine your freedom or your oppression under the Chinese Communist Party. The source I had in this article a few years back claimed that the Chinese Communist Party had extended that program to include Americans. In other words, they have very similar databases on Americans as well. In fact, one of my sources on that was an individual who helped them build it in China. Now, these are a few major stories we've seen recently. What are a few others? While the Chinese telecommunications conglomerate Huawei and its subsidies were charged in a racketeering conspiracy to steal trade secrets. Huawei is part of the Chinese Communist Party's One Belt, One Road initiative. They go and build these basically technology infrastructures in foreign countries. And built into that is a lot of times the types of social monitoring systems you have in China, in mainland China, such as a social credit system. Huawei being charged is not a minor thing. Each of these stories taken by themselves are major. And we're seeing in the past 2 to 3 weeks many, many, many stories like this. The U.S. State Department also changed the classification of Chinese state-run media in the U.S. They are now no longer just registered under FAR, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. In other words, they're no longer just foreign agents. Now they're recognized as official foreign missions of the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, they're basically recognized as foreign government offices, and this is a really big deal. Among the media that were included among those 5 was China Daily. China Daily runs China Watch, and as some of you may remember, about 2 weeks ago, there were 35 Republican senators and other officials who wrote an open letter to Attorney General Barr asking him to investigate the Chinese Communist Party's operations under China Watch. And they allege in their letter that the Chinese Communist Party, through China Daily, was placing advertisements, paid propaganda inserts under China Watch in 30 American newspapers. It means, well, first off, that for a very long time, going back, probably 2008 or 2010, a lot of U.S. media have been accepting money from the Chinese Communist Party through China Daily to publish official state-run Chinese propaganda. And this means that under the new designation, where China Daily is an official foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party, that if newspapers that have been running those, including New York Times, Washington Post, and others, continue to do so, they will officially be running propaganda, paid propaganda, directly from a foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party. That is pretty significant. Many, many issues, many cases in the past 2 to 3 weeks, each of which taken by themselves are pretty significant, but when taken as a whole suggest something much bigger is taking place right now. As an investigative reporter, what I look at are patterns and anomalies. And you can take patterns and put them in a line and then draw a line through them. That will show you the trajectory. In other words, you can see where something begins and where something ends, or get a general idea of it. Where I traced this to was in 2008, when the director of the FBI said that the U.S. needed to make a whole-of-society approach to face what he called a whole-of-society threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And this is a quote from Wray, Christopher Wray. He said, quote, "One of the things we're trying to do is view the China threat as not just a whole-of-government threat, but a whole-of-society threat on their end. And I think it's going to take a whole-of-society response by us." He also said that, quote, "collectors," what the intelligence community calls people who collect intelligence on behalf of agencies or governments, had infiltrated U.S. universities. And he said, quote, "I think in this setting, I would just say that the use of non-traditional collectors," and this is important, "especially in the academic setting, whether it's professors, scientists, or students, we see in almost every field office that the FBI has around the country." Taken in context of what we've seen recently, I think this is important to note. Now let's look at something else. The Trump administration in, I think it was 2018, 2019, the National Intelligence and Security Center updated its national counterintelligence strategy, first time since they've done it since 2015, to state, quote, that Russia and China operate globally, use all instruments of national power to target the United States, and have a broad range of sophisticated intelligence capabilities. The new National Counterintelligence and Security, strategy now targets directly Chinese influence operations in the U.S. as well as Russian. And that began actually with an official letter from the Trump administration, signed by Trump himself. It also says that, quote, "Threat actors are using these capabilities against an expanded set of targets and vulnerabilities. Foreign intelligence entities are targeting most U.S. government departments and agencies, even those without a national security mission, as well as national laboratories, the financial sector, the U.S. industrial base, and other private sectors and academic entities." Again, we have national laboratories and academic entities listed as targets of foreign espionage operations, notably China and Russia. This is again from the FBI. This is 2018 in December. Talks about China's non-traditional espionage, taken in context of the document we just went over. Again, what does non-traditional espionage refer to? Quote, "These talent recruitment and brain gain programs, as some in China call them, also encourage theft of intellectual property from U.S. institutions. For example, China's talent recruitment plans, such as the 1,000 Talent programs." Remember the Harvard professor who was just charged under the 1,000 Talents program. FBI talked about this in 2018. Take that in context of the national security strategy and in context of Christopher Wray's calling out these programs. China's 1,000 Talents program offer competitive salaries, state-of-the-art research facilities, and honorific titles such as that Harvard professor who has not yet been found guilty. I should note he's being charged. This is allegedly with him. And it says, quote, "They are luring both Chinese overseas talent and foreign experts alike to bring their knowledge and experience to China, even if that means stealing proprietary information or violating export controls to do so." And we can assume that when the FBI published this on their website 2 years ago, that they less than 2 years ago, that they understood this was happening. And if they understand it's happening, then very likely they had information on individuals who were involved with it. Let's take a step back and talk about how Chinese espionage differs from Western espionage. Because I can tell you, like, with my own personal work, 2008 to 2012, notably, when I was doing a lot of on-the-ground investigations in New York for the Epoch Times, especially into the United Front operations of the Chinese Communist Party, which we'll go into more. They actually, in fact, if you go to the Chinese consulate website right now, they actually list the United Front as one of their operations, and as well as the liaison department, which is their political warfare department. And we'll go deeper into both of these, but hear me out first. When I was first investigating these guys, of course, I had people telling me, "Oh, that guy's a spy, that guy's a spy." And I mean, you look at him, and the guy looks like he hasn't showered in a week. I'm like, that's not a spy. I don't believe anything you guys are telling me. Sure enough, you find that, the James Bond persona that we have of spies in the U.S. doesn't really hold up when it comes to a lot of what other countries do, China especially. And this goes into one of the ways that they identify targets of espionage. For the Chinese Communist Party, they have, they'll use 1,000 pseudo-spies instead of one official spy. A lot of the ways that the defense community will talk about this is this analogy of a beach. And suspend disbelief for a minute, because this is just, and it's an allegory, right? It's just a story to illustrate a point. Now, imagine that the U.S., China, and Russia were trying to conduct an espionage operation on a beach, and the target of the espionage operation is on the sand itself. So the United States would use, its satellite surveillance technologies, high-tech monitoring. It would try to, get satellite images of the beach and try to understand the sand from that perspective. The Russians would send in a few, GRU officers in the dead of night to go steal 5 buckets of sand and rush back. The Chinese Communist Party would send 1,000 tourists. They'd lay out their beach towels, and after the end of the day, they'd go back and they'd shake out their beach towels, and all the sand would fall off, and they'd have more information than any other country. And that's a really clear explanation of how they work. They'll have basically thousands and thousands of non-traditional spies, people who may not even be getting paid for what they're doing, but who are encouraged by Chinese spy departments to steal information if they see it. There is an incentive to commit acts of espionage for non-spies under the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party will use a lot of, say, unofficial spies. They provide financial or say life incentives for people who are not getting paid officially as spies to conduct acts of espionage, most noticeably the theft of intellectual property or information. And basically, a lot of the Chinese spy departments work by offering these incentives to non-traditional spies. And again, we heard the phrase now multiple times, non-traditional espionage. Now let's get into the difference in how the U.S. would define espionage or motivations for espionage versus the way the Chinese Communist Party would define the motivations for espionage. Now, the acronym used in the West is MICE, M-I-C-E, and that is money, ideology, creed, or ego. In other words, if someone's going to, say work with U.S. government intelligence agencies, either they're doing it for the money, they're doing it because they believe in an issue and they believe that the government is supporting them, such as a lot of the counter-terror operations. They get local informants. Creed, in other words, your belief aligns with it, or your ego. You just like the way you feel being an informant or something like that. The Chinese Communist Party is different. They look at moral flaws. And those are, for example, lust, power, fame, and greed. We've all heard of the lust element. They talk about honey traps. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party would invite government officials back to China. They do this frequently, as a matter of fact, including U.S. government officials. In fact, one of the main operations of the United Front, and Mike Pompeo mentioned some of this recently, where he talked about how the United Front has databases on all 50 U.S. governors and their positions on China. As a reporter, I've had other government officials tell me, including city council members, any level of government you're in the U.S., whether it's a governor, whether it's a senator, whether it's a member of the House, whether it's a local city council member who no one's really paying attention to, the Chinese Communist Party will invite you on paid trips to China. And because they can't technically accept money from a foreign government, they have ways of getting around it. So, for example, they'll have to pay like $200 for a 2-week 5-star trip to China. And during that trip, the Chinese Communist Party will try to exploit them in different ways. This is what the United Front does. And one of the branches under the United Front that did a lot of these operations previously that I knew of was the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, the OCAO. And so what is lust? Well, government officials traveling to China might get wined and dined and have a great time and then wake up next to a beautiful young girl only to find that the entire night had been recorded. And suddenly they're blacklisted for the rest of their lives. It could be more basic honey traps, such as there was this U.S. military contractor in Hawaii a few years back who had a Chinese girlfriend. And that Chinese girlfriend just had a very suspicious interest in U.S. nuclear documents. And he just, acts of love, had to provide her with these nuclear documents. You know, love makes you do crazy things. It could also be in, say, targeting individual companies. And this is so easy to do, it's sickening, to be honest. The Chinese Communist Party will go on LinkedIn. Let's say, for example, they want to target a major U.S. corporation and they want to get into their networks. Very easy to do. They'll go on LinkedIn, they'll type in the company's name, and they will map the company's entire employment structure. Then they'll find the IT worker, and he's sitting at home doing his own thing, playing on his computer, and suddenly this beautiful Chinese agent messages him and says, "Hey, I love your profile. How'd you like to talk some more?" And he's going to throw himself on the floor. Anything she wants, he's going to give her, 9 times out of 10. And they can use those tens of thousands of members to provide votes to candidates who fall under their system. And so political candidates who start getting the votes of all the tongs have usually struck deals with these organizations, and that is power. Historically, basically the Chinese government, before the Communist Party, the Chinese system of government didn't stretch below the county level. The county magistrate was the lowest form of government. And below that, you had a somewhat of a bottom-up system of maintaining social order. And these were family associations, guilds, say just organizations, hometown associations, you name it. These were the tongs. And when Chinese people immigrated abroad, they maintained that bottom-up form of governance, which is the reason that Chinatowns are so insulated. They're so hard to understand from the outside. They're so hard for government officials and even police to get into. It's because the tongs run them. Beneath a lot of tongs are the triads, the Chinese mafia. And so, for example, in New York City, one of the biggest tongs is the Fujian American Association. They are very closely tied to the Chinese Communist Party. And this is publicly exposed. I mean, they operate openly. It's publicly exposed. And beneath the Fujian American Association is the Fuqing Gang, also publicly exposed, funny enough. They operate openly. The Fuqing Gang is one of the largest transnational organized crime groups in the world. They're human traffickers, drug traffickers, extortionists, you name it. And then there's fame. Fame is, of course, not so much celebrities. They might target them, but not as much. A lot of times they'll use fame to go after U.S. academic community. So, for example, you're a doctorate, you're a professor, you've written these brilliant reports and nobody reads them, which is the sad reality for a lot of very smart people. They do these great research reports, and who honestly takes time to go and sit down and read some research reports? But they're going to get called to China and someone's going to say, "Oh, I read your report. It's the greatest thing I've ever read. How would you like to come to China? People here love it. They'd love to hear you talk about it." This professor, it's going to be like a dream come true. They're going to go to China. They're literally going to roll out a red carpet, and they're going to have this big conference, and they're going to have very well-educated, very well-spoken students asking scripted questions. And they're going to be like praise questions. "Oh, you're so wonderful. This information is fantastic. You seem so clear on this. Now tell me, why is America so hostile to China? Why are they afraid of the rise of China?" Then, of course, there's greed. And greed is going to be your businessmen, your politicians, and so on as well. Business incentives, financial incentives, working with Chinese factories. When they recruit tongs, for example, through the United Front, I've had sources, for example, one of them being a former Chinese spy who actually helped them build these systems. He claimed that the way they give financial incentives to the tongs when they bring them under the United Front is they'll have them, for example, start an import-export business. And when they do business with China importing goods, let's say they buy $1 million worth of goods, on the Chinese books, they will only charge them half of that. And so let's say they make $1 million purchase, they'll only be charged $500,000. And how is the U.S. government going to ever prove that was given as an incentive and not just, say, a discount for a respected customer? But they will have paid through those means, this company $500,000, which will go to this individual for being part of that system. So, long story short, that's how Chinese espionage works when it comes to recruitment. Now let's look at the website as it currently stands of the New York Chinese Consulate. And what is this? listed as one of the divisions of it, you have the United Front Works Department of CPC, Communist Party of China Central Committee. You also have the International Liaison Department of the CPC Central Committee. In other words, one of the foreign espionage branches of the Chinese Communist Party officially on the New York Chinese consulate websites operating in the United States. And the Liaison Department, which is the alternate name of the General Political Department, which is the political warfare branch of the Chinese military, operating in the United States, officially on the surface, in the open, under the Chinese consulate. Why is a foreign espionage branch operating under the Chinese consulate in New York openly? One that very openly goes and targets foreign Chinese communities, such as Chinatowns, that goes and targets U.S. government officials. And why are they able to list publicly their political warfare department as an official mission under the New York City Chinese consulate, the liaison department? We hear all this noise about Russian influence in our elections and all this stuff. The Chinese Communist Party has an entire warfighting department focused on political warfare, operating openly under their Chinese consulates on U.S. soil. Think of how significant that is. We'll be going into that more. First, let's go more into the United Front. I have here a document from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission from 2018 in August. And it says, quote, "To carry out its influence activities abroad, the UFWD, United Front Works Department, directs overseas Chinese work." In other words, the United Front Work Department, in the open, works on overseas Chinese works, targeting the expat community of Chinese people. They even regard second and third generation Chinese immigrants as part of this system. And it continues, quote, "which seeks to co-opt ethnic Chinese individuals and communities living outside China, targeting people based on their race on U.S. soil," United Front Works Department. And again, operating in the open, as we just saw, in the United States, just one example under the New York City Chinese consulate. And it adds, quote, "while a number of other key affiliated organizations guided by China's broader United Front strategy conduct influence operations targeting foreign actors and states," such as what Mike Pompeo noted, that they're targeting U.S. governors. And it lists also other organizations in the United Front work. Among the four that it notes are the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, Chinese Association of International Friendly Contacts, the Confucius Institutes, which operate in a lot of U.S. universities and which notably provide financing to a lot of U.S. universities in order to have their facilities there, and the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, again operating openly in many, many U.S. universities. And so, on this note, if the Confucius Institutes are known to be part of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Works Department, why are they able to provide finances to American universities? Why are universities being allowed to accept money from a foreign espionage branch of a hostile government under a hostile operation? Why are they able to accept money from that? And again, the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations listed here as an operation, an organization of the United Front Works Department. Again, a foreign espionage branch of the Chinese military, operating openly in the United States. Why are major U.S. universities allowing known operatives under the United Front Works Department to run student associations at their schools? Something important to ask. Continuing on this document, I'm going to read a couple of quotes. It notes that a lot of U.S. think tanks are directly involved in this. It says, under a section called Funding of U.S. Academic and Policy Discourses, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies received funding tied to the China-United States Exchange Foundation, CUSEF, which is registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Why is Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies receiving money from a Chinese Communist Party foreign agent? And now get this, it adds that, quote, according to foreign policy, CUSEF, again that registered Chinese foreign agent, it says their partnership with Johns Hopkins SAIS is not its first with U.S. academic institutions and think tanks. It says, quote, as it has also cooperated with the Brookings Institute, CSIS, Atlantic Council, Center for American Progress, East-West Institute, Carter Center, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, all of which are influential in the U.S. foreign policy community. In other words, these think tanks I just listed and other academic institutions just listed, it says here, quote, influential in the U.S. foreign policy community, in other words, interfering with U.S. foreign policy. Why are they allowed to accept money, or under this partnership, with a registered foreign agent of the Chinese Communist Party? And if we think about the significance we've just seen with a lot of these cases of individuals getting charged for accepting money from the Chinese Communist Party to be part of its foreign espionage operations, how many more individuals are being, say, co-opted under very similar programs? Now think about it. If a Harvard professor, the head of its chemistry department, was able to be charged for being part of the Chinese Communist Party's 1,000 Talents program and not disclosing those payments, and you have here noted directly that there are major U.S. think tanks and academic institutions cooperating with a registered foreign agent of the Chinese Communist Party, and all of these organizations are involved, influential, in U.S. foreign policy, how many more individuals could be charged under very similar crimes? How many of these think tanks have sold themselves out? That's a serious question that I think needs to be answered, especially if we're going to be having real conversations about foreign influence in our political system. Now let's get into some of the direct programs, open programs the Chinese Communist Party has for these types of operations. We've been discussing the 1,000 Talents program. There are a whole lot of others. Among the others are Project 863, regarded as one of the main programs directing China's economic theft. China 2025, which was taken as an update to Project 863, directing Chinese economic theft, and it identifies all sorts of different high-tech sectors. The Torch program, the 211 program, the 973 program, the One Belt, One Road initiative, the technology transfer centers of the Chinese Communist Party, also called National Demonstration Centers. And important note on those, we all hear about the Chinese Communist Party's military and other organizations stealing U.S. intellectual property. What do they do after they're done stealing it? Well, they're transferred through the technology transfer centers and national demonstration centers, which notably operate openly under a lot of Chinese universities. Let's do another deep dive into this. We have some different, say, categories of branches under some of these programs. And I mentioned the 973 program. And we have here a list of programs under the Chinese Ministry of State Security, which is basically you could think of it as like a combination between the FBI and the CIA, but for China. One of the programs is the National Basic Research Program, also called the 973 program. And another one here is the National High-Tech Research and Development Program, also known as Project 863 or the 863 program. And I have here also listed various branches under the State Council's National Science Foundation of China. State Council is the official technical government of China, which still answers to the Chinese Communist Party. Now look at all these different branches. Look at how many there are. These are all, say, child branches of parent organizations that are involved in foreign espionage. Think of how many of these have overseas operations. These are lists of overseas programs. And how many people are involved with this overseas. because obviously if they're operating on U.S. soil, which it claims they are, then obviously either Chinese nationals are running them or they're cooperating with people here. How many people could be included in this? I have here actually a very good book, China's Industrial Espionage, Technology Acquisition and Military Modernization. Really worth a read if you're into these topics. It's a bit academic, but it's one of the best research documents I've read on this stuff. It says that the Torch programs, I mentioned the Torch program being one of these programs, targets high-tech commercial industries. It says the 973 program is for research programs. The 211 program is for, quote, reforming universities. And it says that there are, quote, countless programs for attracting Western-trained scholars back to China. If these programs, and we've seen how many there are now, look to, quote, foreign collaboration, and they do this openly, how many foreign collaborators are involved with this? Now let's move on, looking at the broader picture of warfare under the Chinese Communist Party and how all this ties together. We have here a research report from the Project 2049 Institute, which is actually a pretty good think tank. They do some really good reports on this stuff. And it's the People's Liberation Army General Political Department, Political Warfare with Chinese Characteristics. Now, we mentioned the Liaison Department. I showed you the Chinese Communist Party's, the Chinese Consulate in New York's website where they mention the Liaison Department. That is another name of the General Political Department, and that's what this report's about. It says, quote, political warfare employs strategic psychological operations as a means of leading international discourse and influencing policies of friends and foes alike. Propaganda carried out both during peacetime and in armed conflict amplifies the intentuates the political effects of the military instrument of national power. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party has an official propaganda department, right? Well, an official political warfare department operating openly in the United States under its liaison department, publicly listed on the New York City Chinese Consulate. If we were really having a discussion in the United States about foreign disinformation, about foreign influence in politics, why are we allowing a foreign military's political warfare department to carry out operations that are publicly known to be targeted at leading international discourse and influencing policies? If we're having real conversations about the Chinese Communist Party running, say, disinformation, if we're talking about Russian disinformation and Russian trolls online, why are we not talking about the liaison department or the general political department operating openly in the U.S.? This is important now. Let's read a direct quote from this. Among all the CCP communities, Chinese Communist Party, GDP/LD, General Political Department/Liaison Department, appears most closely aligned with the United Front system. And so, in other words, if the General Political Department works through the United Front or aligns with the United Front, and it's engaged in strategic psychological operations as a means of leading international discourse and influencing policies, publicly known to be running Confucius Institutes and running the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, why are we allowing this to happen? Why is this allowed to happen on U.S. soil? And if we talk about, in addition to that, foreign agents working under these connected networks are allowed to openly work with institutions able to influence American policies, then why are we openly allowing registered foreign agents to target and work with groups like the Brookings Institute, like Johns Hopkins, like other organizations that are engaged in U.S. foreign policy? And now we know that China Daily, through its China Watch sections, according to these Republican senators, running ads or running paid inserts in 30 U.S. publications, among them New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, running paid propaganda from China Daily, which is now registered as a foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party. Why are they allowed to do that? Why are they allowed to accept money to publish paid disinformation from a foreign government. Let's continue. Let's get into the bigger picture of how the Chinese Communist Party views propaganda and the control of perceptions. We can look at the three warfares doctrine. I have here an article from The Diplomat, which is a pretty decent news outlet. The technical name, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, is San Zhong Jianfa. This is Three Warfares Doctrine, approved by the Central Military Commission under the People's Liberation Army in 2003 under the Chinese military. In other words, a military operation approved in 2003 under the Chinese Communist Party engaged in media warfare, legal warfare, and psychological warfare. Let's read a quote from this article. It says, quote, "At the operational level, the three warfares became the responsibility for the PLA's General Political Department's Liaison Department, which conducts diverse political, financial, military, and intelligence operations. In other words, the three warfares adopted into the Chinese military strategy in 2003 as an official operation works under the General Political Department's Liaison Department. And the Liaison Department is listed as an official mission in New York City and probably many other places under the Chinese consulate's website. A department that not only wages political warfare, but that openly carries out the three warfares doctrine, targeting media, legal, and psychological operations on U.S. soil." Let's go into this more. Psychological warfare, what does it include? According to The Diplomat, I'll explain it more. Psychological warfare is the coordinated use of strategic psychological operations. Media warfare is overt and covert media manipulation. Makes you wonder about whether these China Daily inserts are tied to, quote, overt and covert media manipulation. And legal warfare. And it says legal warfare designed to manipulate strategies, defense policies, and perceptions of target audiences abroad. In other words, a directed operation of the Chinese military running openly in the United States under the Liaison Department is interested in overt and covert media manipulation. And we know that the Chinese Communist Party's official missions now under China Daily are publishing paid inserts in major U.S. publications. And so let's look into what is psychological warfare and how it ties into disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. We'll start with propaganda because it's probably what we hear about the most. Propaganda is not necessarily misinformation or disinformation. Propaganda is not necessarily false. Propaganda it's designed to make you have an emotional reaction to something. Propaganda is meant to have this kind of Pavlov's dog effect on you. And a lot of big outlets could be accused of doing this. And so what do they work on? They work on emotional memory. Now, it could be, for example, a wartime poster, say, eliciting a patriotic response or eliciting a hatred for a targeted group or entity. It could be, for example, something made to make you feel pride, something made to make you feel hate, something made to make you feel unhappy, satisfied, angry. It ties into advertising. We could read Edward Bernays' book, Propaganda, and see how advertising industries use this, which also influenced how a lot of political organizations use it as well. It ties into, again, this Pavlov's dog effect, where this Soviet scientist gave a dog a bowl of food, rang a bell, and eventually the dog would salivate just as if there was food, even if there was not food, every time it heard that bell. In the same way, people can be programmed to react through unconscious means to targeted stimuli. This is one of my big problems with what they call new journalism, which a lot of big publications do. And I don't know if they're doing this intentionally or not, but it has this effect. And what is new journalism? It's narrative-based policy journalism. In other words, narrative-based telling of, say, advocacy stories. Let's say, for example, you wanted to use a Pavlov's dog effect to make them react in a certain way to a political issue. Big topic right now, for example, illegal immigration. If you wanted to make someone think positively of illegal aliens, you would tell the biggest sob story you could possibly find. You would bring them through an emotional journey of one family or one individual on what they go through in their whole story of coming to the U.S. And I'm not trying to say for or against anything, just telling you how it works. You would bring them through this entire emotional journey, and then you would create a symbol, in other words, a stimuli, around the political issue. And you would say, this entire emotional journey you've been through is a symbol, or is tied to this symbol of this policy that we are trying to push at this given moment. When people see that policy, when people see that issue, they will react unconsciously along with the emotional memory they developed from going through that emotional experience. Now let's go into misinformation. Misinformation is different from disinformation. Misinformation is just the outright statement of false information. And this is typically used strategically. For example, if there's a legitimate movement, so people are digging up legitimate information, through a misinformation operation, you would intentionally insert false information into the group's narratives, that would serve a few key purposes. One, it would make the people within the movement start looking at false information and be unable to discern what is true and what is not true. They would also start seeing false information and be like, I think you guys are all crazy. And it could also be used to make the public, or say, dissuade the public from joining or being, learning about whatever information operation is taking place. What is disinformation? Disinformation can be a false flag incident. It could be the manufacturing of a false image, a false perception. It ties into this whole idea of the Potemkin village, a false village erected to give a false reality, right? It could be the creation of a narrative that is, for example, 99% false, but has a single grain of truth. That grain of truth is what the person would point to anytime the narrative is questioned. And when it comes to, say, a lot of news discussion and political debates, that's a very useful tool because people question the disinformation operation. The operative could point to that one piece of truth and say, do you dare question this? And 9 times out of 10, that person's going to choke up and not being able to talk. And they're not going to be given a platform to explain, say, the 99 points of falsehoods. People will not listen. It could also be something that is overall true, but has a false conclusion drawn from it. In other words, you point to true information, but you draw a false conclusion from it. Disinformation takes many forms. One of the ways the Soviets did disinformation was starting up overseas think tanks and research organizations which would publish reports. They would then feed these reports to credible overseas news outlets. The news outlets report it. Government officials respond to it. Foreign governments or agents comment on it and elicit new responses. And eventually the disinformation operation takes on a life of its own. It becomes part of the country's, cultural narrative. Goes into memetics, these types of things. What is a memetic? Richard Dawkins, a radical atheist, coined the term as the idea of how ideas introduced into a society evolve over time to eventually influence the culture. Mimetic warfare is the intentional introduction of ideas into a society with the intention over time of having an intended effect on the country's culture. We can look at a real-world example of the Chinese Communist Party using the 3 warfare system in the South China Sea, because actually, I wouldn't call it fantastically done. It's pretty terrible what they did, but it was a huge success in a battle that was won purely through ideology. So what happened in the South China Sea? Long story short, the Chinese Communist Party started building artificial islands, then started building military facilities on those islands, created no-fly zones, no-go zones, denied access of foreign fishermen, etc. In other words, it did a land grab, traditional conquering into a region it does not have legal ownership over, but did so using a narrative battle of convincing the broader world that they had historical ownership over it. And while it was locked up in the realm of legal battles and diplomacy, the Chinese Communist Party moved forward and completed operations. And so let's look at how that worked. Under the psychological warfare branch of it, they created this narrative of historical ownership and of the 9-dash line. In other words, they created this idea that they had historical ownership of the region, that they were justified in seizing control of the region, and while they kept the argument going in that realm, they moved forward with their operations to seize it. Now, the Chinese Communist Party eventually did lose the legal battle on that. It was proven it did not have historical ownership over that region any more than Italy has historical ownership over the former Roman Empire. There was media warfare. They used censorship and state-run news. Now, internally inside China, they had all their state-run media pushing these narratives under the psychological warfare element of it, the idea of historical ownership in the 9-dash line, and hostile foreign forces intent on stopping China from having what belongs to it. When it came to works abroad under the media warfare operation, they had all their foreign diplomats, all their foreign professors, all their foreign experts talking to foreign media, giving them comments, and journalists being fair, being balanced, are going to quote them 50-50 on every claim. And then anytime a media, say, published a story or a politician spoke out in a way they didn't like, they would challenge it because, again, they're engaged in media warfare. That is a warfare operation, and the U.S. did not regard it as a warfare operation when it came to the media side. And then they also engaged the legal warfare element of it. They went to the international courts and they kept it locked up in the international courts. This combined kept this battle, a hostile takeover of a region, using threats, using military threats, using Coast Guard, military warships, and eventually building military facilities in this region, kept this military operation locked up behind a smokescreen of, say, narratives, ideology, and court discussions. It kept it in the realm of legal battle, media battle, and diplomacy. Now, what is unrestricted warfare? It comes from a 1999 document written by two Chinese colonels, both of whom later moved up in the ranks and became pretty influential in Chinese military operations. The reason why this paper, written by two Chinese colonels, is taking as being so significant these days is because it lists a large number of Chinese military operations, things that we do not technically consider military operations, on a very large swath of categories that we see them carrying out in the open. And among these are, say, non-military operations, trans-military operations, and unconventional military operations. The non-military operations could be things like culture warfare, drug warfare, psychological warfare, media warfare, business warfare targeting companies, economic warfare targeting GDP of countries, etc. The trans-military operations can include things like, for example, cyber attacks, things like that. And the military operations using unconventional systems would include things like the Chinese Communist Party's Assassin's Mace program. If a battle were to enter the military realm, they would engage in, say, surprise attacks, anti-satellite attacks, so on. Things meant to disable the systems that allow an advanced military to function. So, for example, the Assassin's Mace program targeting the U.S. military would not directly target the U.S. military. It would target our GPS systems, it would target our satellites, it would target the electronic components, disabling the things that give the U.S. a technological advantage and allowing a smaller military, well, technically pretty big, but less advanced military, such as that of the Chinese Communist Party, to win in a war. Now, Dr. Michael Pillsbury, in his book Crouching Tiger, wrote that the only time the U.S. had lost a war game operation, a red team operation, against the Chinese Communist Party in these simulated games was when he applied the Assassin's Mace program. And so let's look at a quote from Unrestricted Warfare. It says, quote, "When we suddenly realize that all these non-war actions may be the new factors constituting future warfare, we have to come up with a new name for this new form of warfare. Warfare which transcends all boundaries and limits. In short, unrestricted warfare." So we see now an interesting picture on a few fronts. We see that the Chinese Communist Party has open operations engaged in subversion, engaged in business warfare, engaged in academic, targeting our academic communities, doing political warfare operations, using propaganda as part of those political warfare operations, gaining influence over U.S. media, publishing fake news through it, if you want to call it that, through things like the China Dailies, China Watch, registered as a foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party, targeting student groups, such as the Overseas Chinese Student and Scholars Association, going on and on and on, listed as Chinese military ties to Chinese military operations, ties to operations operating openly into the Chinese consulates, such as Mike Pompeo mentioned that the United Front is targeting U.S. governors. The list goes on and on and on. But at the same time, we also see this very interesting series of events where the United States seems to be going forward with what Christopher Wray talked about in 2018, targeting these different forms of Chinese influence operations and their different forms of subversion. Now, where this will go, we'll have to see. The purpose of this episode, what I wanted to get into, is explaining to people how these entire systems work, how they interrelate, and to show a picture suggesting, I think, that a whole lot of people could be charged if the U.S. government were to ever take this stuff seriously. It does seem now they're taking it seriously. We'll see where it goes. So with that said, everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. We need your support. Click the notification bell if you're on YouTube. Make sure you get our alerts when new videos go up. Going forward on Crossroads, we're of course going to be continuing the same type of interviews we've done in the past. I'm also going to be doing a little more, let's say, analysis such as this. Let me know if you like it or not. Have some good stuff in the works. That said, thank you again. See you all next time.